This
codes.
conference will now be recorded.
These are our relevant codes, and this is where we're going to see not only the plumbing code here on item C is a 2015 of the International Plumbing Code. We also have the energy code, and we also have the existing building code that would be relevant to you as installers. And if you're an HVAC contractor, you would also have the mechanical and fuel gas code. We also have the 2015 International Residential Code identified here. And so we're going to have this that sets up the codes by which now your local authorities, such as a city, town, or county, would then have as the relevant code. Nice thing about Utah is we are under the state provisions for our construction codes. I just got back from Missouri last week, teaching out there for them, and they have the counties and cities that adopt their own codes, and some of them are on the Uniform Plumbing Code, some of them are on the International Plumbing Code, some of them are on the 1997 code, some of them on the 2018, some of them on the 2015, 2006. They're all over the place, and I couldn't imagine working in those states as a contractor and knowing what your relevant code is to be able to go and do an installation, let alone bids and everything else on those. And so we're pretty fortunate, I think, here in Utah in having some consistency. That took place clear back in 1991, 92 sessions to get it to where the state took this over. And now this is what we get to work with. So now that I know these are the codes, I can go into my international codes and say, yeah, this is the one I'm under. I happen to have the 2018 pulled up here. I can go back in and change my years of relevancy. So if I'm going to go back to 2015, I can pick those, and now I should be able to find the 2015 edition here, what will work out of today. So we'll also look at some references in the residential code. But that's kind of where this is set up by the state. And I'm going to go back to my Title 15A. I'm going to show you the different headings we've got. We've got the adoption, which we were just looking at. And I've got the statewide amendments incorporated as part of the state construction code. So this is where I'm going to go and look to see what sections of that plumbing code that's published nationally have I made changes. So if I come in here, the plumbing code, part 3, I can go to any one of these chapters now and see what the respective changes are. And I know we've got questions or a change in the residential section or factors that we'll look at as well in chapter 29. And so we'll kind of show you where that goes as well. But for instance, in chapter 5, we have some amendments to the IPC, such as this. And I'm going to jump between these two screens to show you how this looks. So I'm going to go back up here to the IPC, and I'm going to go to chapter 5, water heaters. And I was looking at specifically, go back to here, 502.4. Says it is deleted and replaced with the following: seismic supports. As a requirement, water heaters shall be anchored or strapped to resist horizontal displacement caused by earthquake motion. Strapping shall be at points upper third and lower third. So if we go to the section 502.4 in the IPC, it just says seismic straps and refers you to the building code. So it's nice to know that there's actually been an amendment. Give me what that direction is so that you as plumbers do not have to go out and actually buy an international building code or residential code for that matter. If you're dealing with residential only, what is expected of you to comply with the state law? They give us that 1/3 and lower third. So me working for a jurisdiction, I buy at least 3 copies of this. I have to by state law to provide access to my public to come in and actually have access to read the books. I'll go in there, actually write in that section of the code right here. It says state amended. So I know to go look on the state website to see what that change is. So any questions on state amendments or how that works? I mean, we'll go through some of these later on, but have I lost anybody, or does this make sense so far? The awkward silence. Okay, well, I'm going to assume by no one responding that I guess I haven't lost anybody. And feel free to come over here and enter a message here as well, because I can see that real time if you're waiting for a delay for your mic and stuff to pick up. By all means, just type in your questions here too as we go along, and we can answer those as we go. But going back to the state codes, I'm going to jump out of this title. We'll come back to it later on, but I want to show you some other titles that are pretty relevant to how the processes work. With the adoption of these codes, I'm going to go back into the international code here. I'm actually going to go under administration, because this is what cities, counties, towns, all of those basically have as the state adopted law for their practices. Now they'll create policies and such as how to enforce this. DOPL does the same thing with some of their regulations on licensing. They have the rule established by legislation, and then they go in and they actually adopt policies on how they actually will, I guess, enforce or enact and deal with the actual legislation. So legislation gives us the path, and we just have to figure out how we're going to get there and satisfy that legislative action. So for instance, I have all these requirements, applicability, I know when it's required, maintenance, depending on what type of maintenance you're doing, you may have to have permits, move buildings, historic. I mean, all these are going to be covered in the code on what I deal with. Now, this is the one I want to come to is 102.8.1, conflicts. Where conflicts occur between provisions of this code and reference standards, the provisions of this code shall apply. So that means a standard is not what the governing rule is. And we also have provisions in reference codes and standards where they extend the reference of the code or subject matter is within the scope of this code, provisions of this code are applicable, shall take precedence over any other reference code or standard. And then we've got, if it's not covered in here, we've got to go to some other standard or whatever else. So there's, I wish I could get rid of this again. Keeps coming up. Anyway, but we've got, if we have a conflict, and we'll talk about that here in just a bit too, because I understand there's some pretty significant conflicts going on with installation practices. This code and the way this is adopted is intended to be our sole reference. But I've been doing a lot of research lately. I'm dealing with not only plumbing circumstances with water purveyors or districts and such that may supply services for sewer, stormwater, potable water systems. It may not be under like a jurisdiction of cities. It may be a district. Prime example of this is your Rocky Mountain Power circumstance, where you've got Rocky Mountain Power that spans most of the state. You've got some inconsistencies between what they require for an installation for their service versus what the National Electrical Code. You have the same situation here in the plumbing code. You may have a water district that has several communities that it serves, and it has a specific requirement, and there's a lot of gray area. And researching this, how they're getting away with not meeting this state construction code is they pretty much say, if you want to connect to our services, you will make this standard applicable on your site, which there's some ethics conversations going on right now, because this, again, this was intended to be the sole responsibility in code. I'm going to pull up a site plan here to show you where I'm talking about. But most of your site plans here, you have a street out here, and you have a public right of way. And that would be, typically the back edge of sidewalk. And you have a park strip in there, and then you have sidewalk, and then you go out to your street. Well, this right of way, kind of shown on this, from here forward is under design standards. That's the right of way. That's basically engineered standards that the cities or counties and stuff use to design their systems. And that's where the state construction code is supposed to take over, is from that property line on into the building. And there's a term out there we call the point of service connection. So on most of your city properties here, for example, I've got a sewer lateral that comes out from the home, goes out and ties into a sewer main out in the street. the service point of connection is typically way out here in the road. And so that's what makes the property owners responsible for that whole lateral, even though it's not even on their property, up to their home, including the clean out. That's why sewer districts don't like to take responsibility and come in and fix that. If something goes wrong here out in the road, they make you as the homeowner or the contractor then come in and do that, and they'll bond you and everything else while doing that work. Well, on the inverse side, a lot of them are making you come in and actually put in some kind of a material here for the clean out. Well, it's well outside the public right of way. And based on the definitions we have in the code for a plumbing system and what that includes, that plumbing system under the IPC is that whole lateral out to where it connects into the main. On the culinary water aspect, we've got the water meter out here in a park strip generally. It'd probably be in this area here. That service point of connection would be usually the meter yoke. So as the pipe comes out of that meter yoke, goes under the sidewalk, that is now the responsibility under the ownership of the home. They would be responsible to replace that line. Any leaks after that, they're responsible. But again, we have some water districts out there taking the strong arm saying that pipe has to be this type of material, where technically, again, it should be covered
It is
under.
cold. I noticed that when.
Jeff, do you have a question?
No.
Hey, Dave,
Okay.
Can you hear me?
No, I just bumped the button. Sorry.
Oh, not a problem. I was hoping you'd chime in with a good question or maybe an experience on this, because I know this is happening, especially in the Salt Lake Valley right now. I have this same thing. For those that don't know who I am the building official for Springville City. So I am a part of the government agencies that deal with code enforcement, dealing with construction codes. And unfortunately, this is a battle that neither of us can really decipher clearly in the state law, because the IPC clearly states it is all the way out into the meter, but yet when you look under the language for the utility companies, they actually have standards they can require that go well beyond the public right of way into the property, and they can mandate. If they are requiring, yes.
I think, Dan, you had a question?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to, we're trying to get video down here in MATC and we have none.
Okay, I'll work on it.
But yeah, if you could try and dial us in again and see if we are able to pick up on this side, but we're having troubles listening and connecting on just my phone here.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Yeah. Keep us in tune to when you get connected on here. And if you need me to go back and talk about points I made, because I'm using slides and such to kind of show reference to certain things on a site plan. So without video, it'd be very difficult to follow along. So
Yeah.
please don't hesitate to ask those questions when that time comes, if you've got it available.
Thank you.
So going back to the definitions or the clear path of delineation between responsibilities between one government agency and another, I can tell you right now it's very unclear. And my path, as far as a building official, seems very clear. And I'll show you some other legislation as to why I kind of get concerned when I have other agencies step in and tell me I have to require this other item or this other material. That's the only path. And when we get into talking about licensing and such, and what I'm going to show you some what's considered unprofessional conduct by building inspectors to help you understand why maybe they act the way they do. Hopefully they're acting fair and ethical, but there are some very specific guidelines that are under their conditions that the state has identified, and it's pretty hard to mistake what your responsibility is where that comes from. So I have conflicts in my own jurisdiction. For example, we require commercial site plans for any commercial building when it comes in, and they'd give a pretty elaborate site plan, much more complicated and complex than what I'd deal with a single family residence. And usually on those site plans, we have a utility drawing, and on those utility drawings, it would identify where my lateral connection would be from the street, what the size of that lateral would be tying onto the main, the meter location, the size of that meter, the vault information and details, and then it would also dictate the size of the lateral coming from that meter into the building and any locations of any shut-offs or any other equipment or backflow prevention or check valves that may be provided with that, just that water lateral. Same kind of information is available on a site plan for the sewer lateral. Well, when we come into a site plan, I'm a part of what's called a development team, review team, as well as my water department that supplies the water, our electrical department. All these people are part of this development review committee. We overlook this, or we look at this site plan to see that it complies with all city ordinances and state laws for construction and so on and so forth, and that the design is going to work and not cause any problems with the building. And we move forward towards construction. Well, usually on these site plans, I'll have my water department that says the water line size has to be the same, the same size as the meter. So if my site plan shows a 2-inch meter, I cannot upsize that to a 2.5 or a 3-inch water line. They require it to be the exact same size. Based on the state construction codes, I can accept anything within the plumbing code as far as materials and sizing, as long as it provides the gallons per minute for all my fixtures within the building. So I have now an individual that's not a licensed inspector, not a individual that regulates outside the public right-of-way other than by ordinance only, that is a conflict to the state construction codes, because I can give you that leeway and should not be mandating the material. I'm hoping that you'll use materials that are for the best circumstance of the building. For instance, I had a lot of cities that I've worked for in the past that required type K copper as the service lateral up to a building. A lot of the areas I worked in the past had acidic or alkali soils. It was not probably the best material, but because we had bad experiences with some piping materials that came out in the 80s and such, they were scared to allow anything but copper, because that was kind of a proven deal, even though they knew it would probably be eaten up by the soils around it and would have to be replaced in probably 15-20 years if it made it that long. So the state, by uniformity, coming in and adopting the state construction codes, was intending to adopt one code that should apply everywhere. And so I went in and I actually changed our ordinance to eliminate that, to give contractors options and stuff when I was the building official up in that area. Another advantage to that is during the recession, I didn't have copper water lines being pulled out of the ground, causing water leaks and stuff at our meter yokes while people were trying to salvage copper in lots that were sitting vacant. If it was poly or something else, they obviously wouldn't rip that out. There was just no salvage value to it, so we actually saved a lot of our existing systems. So the question about the differing materials that the state construction code allows versus what is being mandated by the utility, that would be a great thing to take to your legislators to get clarification where the bounds would be. To me, service point of connection would make sense. It's already defined, already established, but we need that in the legislature to clear it up. Otherwise, we're going to be dealing with the unfortunate events that you deal with on a daily basis if you work in the Salt Lake Valley, of conflicting standards, because you have standards for utilities and you have standards for building departments. So any questions on that? Otherwise, I'm going to move back into the codes a little bit here. But just so you're aware, building departments usually include your plumbing departments. There's not too many plumbing departments out there anymore. They've been absolved and kind of put under the umbrella of a building department. But a lot of the same duties and responsibilities are applicable. So we're basically the ones that are the main managers of applications for permits, approvals of permits and plans, and inspections. And so we are required to follow certain standards within the codes. And like I say, a lot of the same language exists in the building codes as well, not just in the plumbing code. Same with the fuel gas codes and everything else. But it pretty much says in here, it tells us when permits are required. The only thing the state has basically said that is different from what's in here is the Department of Professional Licensing does not enforce or give guidance on the permit fees associated with a city. So we're supposed to follow all of these, but there's no guidance really in here for permit fees. And DOPL has pretty much said we are going to be silent as well. We're going to leave that policy up to the local authorities to establish that based on the size of their department, the number of permits they process, the amount of time, and so on and so forth. So back in 1997, we had what was called the Uniform Building Code. They actually had a fee schedule in there that a lot of the cities and such would adopt, but that went away with the introduction of the international codes that we have now. So we no longer have a table to use as reference. So right now they're all over the place, or could be. We'll come back to this a little bit too to show you some other things, but I want to jump to another section of the code now. I'm going to go into why inspectors act the way they do. Then we'll come back and hit some of the amendments as well. But I'm going to go back to the index of the code, and I'm going to go to Title 58, which is licensing, I believe. Occupations and professions. So this is your licenses as contractors, has architects, has anybody that has a license pretty much in Utah, pharmacists, nurses, drug dealers, liability, I mean, it's all underneath here. Well, we fit down here as inspectors. We are, you as your plumbers, you're going to be under 55, building inspectors under 56. And I'm going to show you where some of these things come in as to why inspectors act the way they do. So we have unlawful conduct and we have unprofessional conduct. So I'm going to come under here because this is where the meat of the whole thing is. So this is where an inspector can lose his license. We have a license just like you as contractors. They have to get a certification through the International Code Council. There's a couple other groups they can go and get licensed under, but they have to have these certifications to then file for an inspector license to the state of Utah. They're granted a license, and then they can start inspecting. Unlawful, if I were to go underneath that one, it'd actually show it is unlawful for me to hire somebody that doesn't have certifications or license, and it's unlawful for me to actually represent myself as a building inspector if I'm not. So similar to a plumbing contractor, if you're a handyman, we'll say an unlicensed individual out there, a handyman that then puts on the side of your vehicle, licensed plumber, licensed contractor, that is actually an unlawful conduct. But this is the conduct of an inspector. We can lose our license for gross negligence if we give wrong information out, if we act unethical, bystanders, engaging in fraud. And this is where number 7 on, building inspector knowingly failing to require that all plans, specifications, drawings, documents, reports be stamped by architects, professional engineers, or both as established by law. So there's very little, especially on the commercial side of things, that can be submitted and approved that is not going to be required to be stamped by an architect or an engineer. 8, a building inspector knowingly failing to report to the division an active or omission of a licensee under this title section. So this is going to say, basically, if I've got somebody out working in the field that I know is not a licensed individual, I am supposed to, by law, report them to the Division of Professional Licensing. This was a big part of the discussion back in a course that I did for contractors in Springville City, where we invited DOPL to come down and do an hour of the training. This was emphasized to us as a city, that they actually wanted us to turn not only just unlicensed individuals in the trades, but also design professionals if they're submitting inadequate drawings or not even having their stamps for the drawings they're doing, and so on and so forth. So they're wanting to have us hit everybody. Okay, so that's one of the requirements under us. We've also got to, under this, if any permit I issue, I have to look and verify that the individual on the permit is a licensed, correctly licensed for the work they're saying they're legally able to do. So for instance, today I had an application for a a project for a manufactured home coming into my jurisdiction. They're moving it from some other location. That is a very specific contractor license for the installation of those. And I could not just accept any license to do that. So unfortunately, they had to go out and hire someone else than what they were originally intending to do the work. Here's the other one, 10. Building inspector's approval of work, which materially varies from approved documents that have been stamped by an architect, professional engineer, unless authorized by the licensed architect. So basically, if I do that, then I'm overriding the stamp of that architect and engineer, and that's considered unprofessional conduct. We can lose our license for that. So even though it meets the code, I oftentimes get calls from contractors asking, hey, this is, can I do this on this project? The code allows me to, but the project manual requires or says they want this. Can I do this other material? Well, the code allows you to, but I'm going to have to defer you back to the architect and the owner to make that call. Again, I have to make sure I stay within the approved documents. So a lot of times you think we're just code. We also have to follow the approved set of plans. Here's the one about the plans. Building inspector failing to produce verification of a current licensure or current certifications for the code. That's where I have to make sure I have my certifications, which for me, I had to do 65 hours of training in 3-year periods. So that's about 21 and a portion hours a year of training I have to do every year just to maintain those certifications, and I have to provide evidence to the state that I have them. I cannot inspect outside of what I have certifications for. And then this is the big change right here, 12, that changed at least a lot of concepts of what the inspectors are acting to. A building inspector requiring work that materially varies from the building codes adopted by the state of Utah. So that's either requiring something that is above what the code requires or not requiring something the code requires. I could have a homeowner call and make a complaint to the state as just as much as a contractor call and make this complaint that I didn't do my job. And if I didn't, I could lose our license. This was a change put in the legislation this year against inspectors. So we had inspectors all of a sudden stepping up their game, which I've heard has caused quite a few problems with certain contractors, especially if you're doing a lot of multifamily housing. They had been getting by with not doing something particular. The code required it. They had to change midstream on the construction of those buildings. Cost quite a bit of money to make that change, especially if you bid it based on what past practices had been on that job site. So these are the reasons that we have to follow through with some of the things, and hopefully you're getting decent plans on projects because it is required. And the interesting thing about this is the licensing requirement for the architects and engineers. Basically, if it's non-residential, if it's brand new resident or brand new commercial, you're going to have, no matter what it is, an architect or an engineer stamp that plan. There is an exception by doing remodel work of area of impact less than 3,000 square feet, does not include any structural changes, then that can be done by a non-registered professional. And that's the only exception. Residential, anything constructed out of the residential codes, it could be 1 and 2 family dwellings and row housing, can be done by a draftsman. Does not have to be done by a licensed architect. But in typically those cases anyway, I'm going to have at least a stamp from a structural engineer, and we'd have to follow through on that. So that's kind of the, yes.
This is Jerry with Robert Spears Plumbing. I was just wondering, is there anywhere in the code that says how long after you set up an inspection that an inspector is supposed to come to the job and inspect?
Yes, I was actually going to go to that one next. So good job. Way to ask that critical question, because there's been some recent changes, and I was asking some other building officials about this today in a meeting I was in at Clearfield today.
Okay.
And I asked this very question because it used to be in a very simple place for me to find. So I'm going to jump out of this section of the code now of licensing and I'm going to go to Title 10, which we call the Utah Municipal Code. So this pretty much, between Title 10 and Title 11, it pretty much tells cities what they can or cannot do. And the one you're talking about in particular, I believe, should be under 9. And gotta remember, I think 5 and 510.
You are fresh on it today.
If it's not in this one, then it's in 10.6.160. But underneath here, this gives the guidance on how much a city can charge for fees, whether they can hook up, what they can charge for plan review costs. And let's see, I actually need to go to the plan review bill, which is 132. So let me back out of that one. So 10.5. 132, I believe, is the one I'm wanting here. So we call this the infamous plan review bill. And this had a lot of changes in it this last year. And this used to have in here this 2A right here. If a town collects a fee for inspection of a construction project, the town shall ensure that the construction project receives a prompt inspection. And then it goes into B. If a town cannot provide that, then they've got to find an independent inspector with fees collected from the applicant. This used to also say that reasonable time was within 3 business days from time of request. As you can see, that is no longer here.
Just leaves it open to reasonable time, and that's up to their judgment. Huh?
Well, as far as when people are still asking me, because I'm getting this, I send emails out to 500 plus people that are associated with the building codes trade and with some of the associations I belong to. I'm kind of the central network guy. And so a lot of people ask me these questions on here. And this is where I used to refer them to that said 3 business days, because that question came up all the time. I mean, it's been coming up for years.
Yeah.
And it's now gone. I went to look it up this year for them to give them that section, and all of a sudden here. So I tell them, but the gentleman's agreement with the homeowners association and everybody else that's engaged in the legislative process is 3 business days, because that's what the law used to say. Before that law was in place, this is 10 years ago, when a lot of the cities and the states and everybody else were going to the 410 schedule. Before that became a common practice, there was a law that was in this same area here that pretty much said building departments had to, if they had a building division, it had to be open up all weekdays, so Monday through Friday. So basically, if I was a one-man band, I could not do a 410 schedule. I had to have inspections on Friday. That disappeared when the state of Utah went to the 410 schedule. So not even our state was following that, and the legislature bought it and said, okay, well, let's do a prompt inspection in a reasonable time, and it used to stay within 3 business days. Unfortunately, 3 business days is gone. I still recommend they follow that, because I think that's been established as what a reasonable time means. And I know there's jurisdictions out there that are not meeting that time frame. And so if not this legislative year, within the next few, I'm sure that will come back into play. So that was a really good question, because it's been a very big problem.
Right.
They were so focused on the plan review side of things on residential with this bill that I think they crossed out one too many lines. And we're more concerned with getting plans approved through cities, because this whole thing has just been, I mean, there's a ton of definitions of what is considered a plan review, what can be a part of that plan review. If it's stamped by a structural engineer or an architect, then technically if the town does not have the plan review done within 14 days, you can see here on this A, for plan review described in 14 days from the day it is given to us, it automatically becomes approved. So
It's pretty sad when they hold up projects because they won't come out and do an inspection.
absolutely, there's ethics that are in question with that. And the unfortunate thing with this is, and this is conversations I have with the Home Builders Association quite often. I am a member of the Home Builders Association down in Utah Valley. sit on their government affairs committee. And so I try to be the liaison between cities and the homeowners association, because it's better to have those conversations before it becomes legislation, because there's about 10% of the towns or cities that cause the problems for the other 90%. The challenge they have is your elected officials are the ones that set the budget for the building department. There's usually a meeting that starts usually, January, into January, first part of February, where your city councilman will usually meet with directors of the city, and their finance director is one of those. That then starts to go through their comprehensive budget, not only the expenditures, but the revenues and everything else. And there are a lot of towns that depend heavily on, the taxes, building permits, things like that to supplement the general fund. So basically a lot of building permits that come in help pay for the librarian across the street. Type thing, and that's not supposed to happen, but it does. But they don't hire inspectors. They don't hire plans examiners. I right now had to go in and change my whole policy and the way we move forward with our department, because it's me and one other guy. And we deal with about 500 permits a year. And about half of those plans that come in are commercial. We have a very large commercial base of plans that come in. So we're a little heavier on that side. We need another guy, but I've had to go to an AM PM inspection time versus a scheduled time like we used to, because I just couldn't get enough inspections in the day. So my guy right now is running his butt off. How do I go and convince my council? Back in 2008, 2009 timeframe, they were too heavy right after the recession hit. So 2010, they laid people off. I did the same thing, and when I worked up in Davis County, worked for Syracuse City, I had a staff of 9 people. Recession hit, I had to lay off 6 of my staff. Went down to a staff of 3 when I left there in 2010. So they are very leery about hiring back on after having laid people off. So we're still trying to get over that. And here it is 6 years after the recession turnaround, and we've got the work. So we have our own challenges. I wished I could do an enterprise fund on permit fees. Then it would ensure that it stayed in my department. Then I could have more power of deciding when or, how many people I need to do that. But we don't have that luxury. Most cities, well, I don't think there's any city or town that I know of that has an enterprise fund on their permit fees, because it's not legislatively backed to do that. So cities are going to take advantage of that.
Jason, you've got a question from Justin that he wrote down.
Okay, so what are your thoughts on engineering department requiring a different permit to access right-of-way in park strip and roads? It's a good question. It is required oftentimes because you have different standards, and because you're working in the right-of-way, you put the community at large at risk. And so that's why they require the bonding and everything else that are part of the park strip. Where once you get on private property, the property owner assumes that risk, not the community at large. So that's why a lot of engineering departments require that permit process to be separate. Did that answer your question, Justin? I know when
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Great. I know when I worked for Syracuse City, we had Orangeburg piping in some of my homes and developments up there. And I had an agreement with my engineering department that we wouldn't charge any fees for permits. We still had the permit filed to create the record. That way we could go back on that as a record to see that the work was done, and we no longer had Orangeburg piping supplying that home. So if anybody did a records request during their diligence period on buying a home, that information was available. We waived the fees for that, and they also took a minimal cash bond, like $500 was all, to cover once the work was done. They refunded the 100% of that bond immediately to the contractor. So it was a pretty painless thing, but that was an agreement we came to from the building division to the engineering department for that case. So they can be workable. Larger communities, you're probably not going to be able to have access to that workability, because usually they have 2 or 3 attorneys that represent the town. Syracuse didn't have an attorney at the time, so I was my own attorney, I guess. We were able to make that call locally. Okay, so this plan review bill, unfortunately, has created a difference of priority. My focus now has to be on plans coming through to get approved under the city's scope, because if not, it's going to worsen the inspection side of things. But because of this bill right here you're looking at, with only 2 people, I've had to actually set time out of my day, not only for myself, but my lead inspector, to do plan reviews. He does all my residential, so there's fewer inspection times available. So this was the first time in my whole career where I did get out to almost 3 days and on turnaround, and I didn't think that was acceptable. And I know there's places out there that go more than a week, which even by our old gentleman's agreement, that should not be acceptable. But again, our hands are tied by the budgeting process and elected officials that do the actual adoption of those budgets. So it is a challenge. We recognize it. There's actually a group out there called the Utah Association of Building Officials, trying to go around and represent the building industry to local authorities, working through the Utah League of City and Towns, working through other associations that councilmen and managers are affiliated with, letting them know what these problems and challenges are coming from if they don't give us the manpower to do our jobs. And I guess there's a balance that we have to create, or they have to be mindful of, is at what point when they're overworked or overburdened with too much, are they to actually be able to do their job and do it well. When we don't do our job, we find out fairly quickly, because we get claims back against the city, and usually those claims cost a substantial amount of money. So there's a risk balance there that cities have to take into consideration. And right now, unfortunately, it's on the wrong side of the pendulum for that exposure, because inspectors are doing a ton of inspections and they just can't do it very adequately. So they depend even more upon the contractor to do it right, and are assuming that they're doing it right, unfortunately. Which is good, as long as we have contractors that are experienced and know what the laws are and follow them and everything else. But we've also got a lot of new people that don't always play by the rules. So, okay, the other side of things, does anybody else have any questions on kind of how this process works? Or I'm hoping that it makes sense to you as to why building departments, I guess, function the way they do or react the way they do sometimes. Wanted to jump back into Title 58, which is our licensing for professionals. But I wanted to jump into 55, which I believe is the contractor side of things. So would include you as plumbers. But I wanted to jump into 305, which is the exemption from licensure, because this is where it causes a lot of heartburn for a lot of people. But this is where it's going to tell us basically where your handyman law is. And what we run into is handymen only need to get a license through the city of which they're operating out of, and they can do work up to $1,000. But then they can file with the state as what they call a non-license agreement. And then that takes them from 1,000 up to 3,000. And that includes both labor and materials, as you can see in HI here. And that doesn't take much to be considered outside their license. I mean, they can't even have the owner of the property go buy the materials and then charge them $3,000 for labor, because it includes materials. They cannot do subsequent billing saying, I'll charge you 1,000 now, 1,000 here, and 1,000 here throughout the project. And or then saying, okay, well, I'll charge you 3,000 up front, and then I'll charge you 3,000 at the end. I think there's like a 6-month period, yeah. work on plumbing, electrical trades project within a 6-month period. Now this one says plumbing and electrical, which handyman cannot do. What this is in reference to is a licensed journeyman electrician or plumber. They can act under this handyman exemption with a $3,000 limit and not be a general or a plumbing contractor. So they can act as handymen. They still have to meet the code. If they're doing it out from under a plumbing contractor company, then they are responsible to secure insurance and workman's compensation in order to qualify under this. And that's where a lot of people get themselves in trouble doing work on the side. And if I'm aware of it, I am obligated to file with the state. That's a requirement. So if you're doing work outside your license, you're doing work without permits, that is an automatic unprofessional, unlawful conduct charge against your license. Doppel had indicated to contractors in a course that I did in August that if you are doing work without a permit as a licensed contractor, they will fine you the $500 or the $800 or $1,000, depending on what violation it is for you. But your license goes automatically before the Uniform Building Codes Commission and the people over your license. And you'll probably be put on probation. If it's a repeat offense, you could have your license suspended or revoked. The revokement is a huge deal for you guys, because if you're set up as an LLC or as a sole proprietor, you have to wait 5 years for you to be able to reapply. So if it's an S Corp or something of that nature, then it's only a 2-year wait. So you got to be really careful on those things. And that was something that came right from Bobby Main, who was the superintendent over the investigators. So it's a big deal. Dave, was there something as far as the amendments we needed to cover? Looks like we're getting pretty close to 7 o'clock.
I don't think so.
I think there was the one question under, let's see, chapter 29 of the IRC, right? The valves?
Yeah, that was the change that was made.
Okay. Let me pop in there real quick. I believe it was 29. Oh, shut off valves. Okay, right here. So 290393. So in here, this is the section of the code that requires shutoffs for all appliances, unless they're for bathtubs and showers. The state has amended that with unless the plumbing appliance or plumbing fixture has a wall mount valve, shutoff valves. So it just gave clarification that we would then consider a wall mount valve type shutoff valve to satisfy the standard shutoff valve in section 29 of the IRC. This is not in the commercial section of the code with the same language, so it only applies to residential. As you can see, there's a lot of changes in backflow prevention in the plumbing code. There's a sewer requirement if you're within 300 feet of a sewer line. The Utah code now says you've got to connect to the approved sewer disposal system. That's a big change they amended. I'm just trying to think if there's any other real big ones. Yeah, there's a little bit of direction on vent terminations here towards the bottom. But the biggest, I guess, direction I can give you is get familiar with Title 15A. That's where your amendments are, Chapter 3. And that's going to go through your plumbing, your residential code, and just go to those respective chapters. Mark them in your books if you have a book. That way you know there's been a state amendment, there's a change, and that's what we're obviously responsible to enforce as an inspection agency. Any other questions?
back on those valves, so like a wall-mounted lav faucet, which is getting popular, you don't have to have a valve for that to shut off.
Right, and that's why that was changed to make that clear to me as an inspector, saying that it actually does satisfy that requirement. So again, it's 290393, unless the plumbing appliance or plumbing fixture has a wall mount valve, shut off valves, and this is where shut off so the language that was added was basically this highlighted blue section.
Right.
That just gives clarity to us as enforcement agencies. So
And that doesn't really tell you where the valve is, so
No.
like now block, we've got a valve at the block, does that account for it?
that's going to be up to the discretion again of the inspectors as far as in relation to that fixture. If I'm coming in there as a serviceman and opening up the space below a cabinet or something, can I see the shutoff for that? That's going to be a discretionary call.
So so most of them are gonna say point of use though.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else, gentlemen?
Jason, thank you very much. We appreciate the information you've given us. I just want to review a couple things. On your screen right now is those who have supported us as an association during 2018. These people make it possible for us to really be effective as an association. And this sponsorship program goes a calendar year, so we've got another month and a half of these people who contribute money and resources to the association. We appreciate it very much. Just a reminder that in the next couple of weeks, you're going to see information about the St. George Conference, March the 28th and 29th in St. George. This is going to be an all-out experience. We've got a lot of classes, both HR and management training. Should be an excellent conference. So please put that on your calendars. And we will not have a December meeting. If you need some more code classes, our classes are full, but I'll see if we can make arrangements and do some other training if we need to for our members. So thank you very much, and we'll see you the first of the year. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jason, appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks.
Jason, this is Jeff.
You bet. Thanks, guys.